On the last day of March in 1913, in a suite at the Grand Hotel in Rome, an American banker lay dying. Outside the thick walls and heavy curtains, the city moved through spring like it always had. Merchants opened shutters. Light spilled across the cobblestone. Priests walked toward morning mass. Inside that room, time had stopped behaving normally. Doctors stood by a bed they could not save. Family members whispered prayers that had no power over what was happening. And the man at the center of it all, the man whose name had become synonymous with American money, lay unconscious, his breathing shallow, his pulse racing toward silence. John Pierpont Morgan, the most powerful financier in the world, was 75 years old. His empire stretched across continents. He controlled railroads that carried American commerce. He owned steel mills that built American cities. He had rescued the United States Treasury not once, but twice, stepping in when presidents could not. He had become so influential that people stopped seeing him as a businessman and started seeing him as a force, something closer to weather than to a person. Markets moved when he spoke. Industries formed when he nodded. Politicians consulted him like an oracle. And yet, in that hotel room, none of it mattered. The power that had bent nations could not bend death. The wealth that could buy governments could not buy another breath. At 12 minutes past noon on March 31st, 1913, Morgan's heart stopped. The man who had dominated American finance for half a century was gone. And with his death, the world lost not just a banker, but the final emperor of an age when individual men could command entire economies. But death, as it always does, arrived with questions attached. The official cause was simple: a long sinking spell, extreme weakness, paralysis of the throat muscles, exhaustion, organ failure, the natural collapse of an aging body pushed too far for too long. That too was the medical story. Clean, expected, dignified. The emotional story was messier, because in the months before he died, Morgan had been dragged before Congress, interrogated like a suspect, forced to defend himself in front of a committee that believed he had too much power. The Pujo Committee hearings in late 1912 had been brutal. Politicians accused him of controlling a money trust, a secret network of bankers who manipulated American finance for personal gain. They questioned his influence, his methods, his very right to exist at the scale he did. And Morgan, a man who hated publicity, who despised being questioned, who believed deeply that his word should be enough, sat through days of hostile interrogation. He answered their questions. He defended his legacy. But those who knew him said the experience broke something inside him. After the hearings, he seemed diminished, tired, aged beyond his years. So when he died just months later in Rome, people wondered, did the stress kill him? Did the humiliation wear him down? Did America, the country he had saved multiple times, repay him by destroying his health? Or was it simply that every empire, no matter how carefully built, must eventually fall? That every king, no matter how powerful, must eventually bow? The truth, as it often is, was probably somewhere in the middle. Morgan died because his body gave out. But his body gave out because he had spent a lifetime carrying weight that would have crushed most men. And when Congress attacked him, it was not just his reputation they questioned. It was the entire architecture of his existence. The idea that one man could hold that much power. The belief that private individuals should control public wealth. The assumption that dynasties were natural, that fortunes should pass from father to son, like titles of nobility. That assumption, that belief in dynasty, is where the real darkness begins. Because the Morgan family story is not just about one man. It is about a lineage that stretched back across the ocean, rooted itself in American soil, and grew into something both magnificent and monstrous. A family that helped build the modern world. A family that shaped industries, influenced governments, and left monuments that still stand. And also a family that carried secrets, absorbed tragedies, and discovered again and again that wealth does not protect the human heart. To understand how death found John Pierpont Morgan in a Roman hotel room, you have to go back farther than his life. You have to go back to where the Morgan name began its American chapter. You have to go back to a world where being wealthy meant nothing unless you could prove you belonged. Part 1. The Foundations of Power. The Morgan family did not arrive in America as conquerors. They arrived as settlers, carrying the same mixture of hope and desperation that filled every ship crossing the Atlantic in the 1600s. The original American Morgan was a man named Miles Morgan, born in Llandaff, Wales, in 1616. His father, William Morgan, was a lawyer and politician, a man of some standing in Welsh society. The Morgans were not peasants. They understood commerce, law, the mechanics of influence. But Wales in the 1600s offered limited horizons. So in 1636, at the age of 20, Miles Morgan did what ambitious young men have always done when their birthplace feels too small. He left. He sailed for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, landing in April of 1636 with his brothers John and James. They settled first in Roxbury, then moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, where Miles would spend the rest of his life. He was not a founder of that town, but he was present early enough to matter. He fought in King Philip's War during the 1670s, defending the settlement during an attack that nearly destroyed it. He worked as a farmer. He married twice, first to Prudence Gilbert, then after her death to Elizabeth Bliss. He accumulated land, not vast estates, but enough to matter in a frontier community where land was the only currency that survived economic collapse. Miles Morgan lived to 83 years old, dying in 1699. He left behind children who would continue the family name, but he also left behind something else, the beginning of a pattern. The Morgan family, from its earliest American days, understood something fundamental. Survival required more than hard work. It required positioning. It required strategic marriages. It required understanding that wealth was not just about money. It was about belonging, about being woven into the fabric of a community so deeply that your name became part of the landscape. His son Nathaniel Morgan continued that pattern. Nathaniel became a prominent member of his small town, holding multiple civic positions: fence viewer, hayward, field driver, constable, surveyor, assessor. These were not glamorous titles, but they were important. They meant trust. They meant influence. They meant that when decisions were made, the Morgan name was in the room. Nathaniel's son, Joseph Morgan, was the fifth of 7 children, born on December 3rd, 1702. Joseph learned to weave as a young man, a practical trade that kept him employed. At 21, he became a soldier in the company of Captain Josiah Kellogg of Suffield. When his father died, he inherited part of Chicopee Field. He married Mary Stebbins in 1735 and raised a family on a farm of 200 acres. When Joseph Morgan died, he divided his property among his sons, Joseph Jr. and Titus. And this is where the Morgan story begins to shift from survival to ambition. Joseph Morgan Jr. was elected lieutenant and later captain of the 8th Company in the 3rd Regiment of the Hampshire County, Massachusetts Militia on April the 26th, 1776. That date matters. April 1776. The Revolutionary War had just begun. Joseph Morgan, Jr. was fighting for American independence at a time when that fight was far from certain. He was betting his life on the idea that the colonies could break free from Britain. And when the war ended and America won, the Morgans were positioned not just as survivors, but as patriots. Their name was attached to the founding story of the nation itself. When Joseph Morgan, Jr. died, one of his sons, Joseph Morgan III, received 112 acres of land. And Joseph III did something none of his ancestors had done. He left farming behind. In 1812, he joined the Washington Benevolent Society as a private banker. This was the pivot point. The moment when the Morgan family stopped being landowners and became financiers. The moment when they stopped thinking locally and started thinking in terms of markets, capital, networks of power that extended beyond any single piece of ground. Joseph Morgan III moved his family to Hartford, Connecticut, which existed as one of the most prominent trade centers in the Connecticut River Valley. In November 1816, he purchased the Hartford Exchange Coffee House, where he acted as an innkeeper. This might sound like a step backward, from banker to innkeeper. But in the early 1800s, coffee houses were more than places to drink. They were hubs, meeting points, places where businessmen gathered, where deals were struck, where information flowed. Owning a coffee house meant being at the center of commercial life. It meant knowing who was buying what, who needed capital, who was expanding, who was failing. It was intelligence gathering disguised as hospitality. In July 1825, Joseph Morgan III bought the Hartford Bank. And then, using the connections and knowledge he had accumulated, he purchased and reorganized the Hartford Fire Insurance Company into the Aetna Fire Insurance Company. This was strategic brilliance. Fire insurance in the early 1800s was not just a business. It was a necessity. Cities were made of wood. Fires were constant. Anyone with property needed protection, and whoever controlled that protection controlled access to commerce itself. When a major fire struck several New York City buildings that held insurance plans from Aetna, Joseph Morgan III made prompt payments to the companies. This was not just good business. It was reputation building. It announced to the financial world that Aetna, and by extension the Morgan family, could be trusted, that their word was their bond, that when disaster struck, they would not hide. They would pay. This is the foundation that John Pierpont Morgan would eventually stand on. Not just money, but credibility. Not just wealth, but the kind of deep institutional trust that takes generations to build. By the time Joseph Morgan III died, the family name meant something in Connecticut. It meant banking. It meant insurance. It meant stability in a young nation that was still figuring out what stability looked like. Joseph Morgan III had a son named Junius Spencer Morgan, born in 1813. Junius grew up inside the world his father had built. He understood banking not as an abstract concept, but as a living system. He started as a merchant, opening a dry goods store on Main Street in Hartford. And in 1836, he married Juliet Pierpont, daughter of the poet John Pierpont. This marriage brought more than love. It brought culture, education, respectability. The Pierponts were not wealthy in the merchant sense, but they were wealthy in something else. They were intellectuals. They were connected to universities, to literary circles, to the kind of social networks that gave a family legitimacy beyond money. On April 17, 1837, Juliet gave birth to a son in her father's house at 26 Asylum Street in Hartford. They named him John Pierpont Morgan. The boy, who would grow up to reshape American finance. The boy who would become so powerful that his death would close the New York Stock Exchange for 2 hours. The boy who would carry the Morgan name to heights his ancestors could never have imagined. But that boy's early life was not a story of easy privilege. It was a story of illness, travel, education, and the slow, grinding process of being prepared for power. Young Pierpont, as he preferred to be called, was a sickly child. He suffered seizures and other mysterious ailments that kept him sheltered at home for long periods. When he was healthy, his parents took him to galleries and concerts, sparking a lifelong fascination with art. He was smart but not particularly interested in school at first. That changed as he grew older. By the time he attended English high school in Boston, he was showing improved grades and a genuine aptitude for learning. In 1854, when Pierpont was 14, his father, Junius Morgan, moved the family to London to begin a new career as a partner in the banking firm of George Peabody and Company. This was a massive leap. George Peabody was one of the most successful American bankers operating in Europe. Joining his firm meant Junius Spencer Morgan was entering the highest levels of international finance. But it also meant leaving his son behind. Pierpont was sent to the Institut Sillig in Switzerland, where he became fluent in French and displayed a strong aptitude for mathematics. Then he was sent to Göttingen University in Germany to improve his German. By the time Pierpont finished his education in 1857, he spoke multiple languages and understood European culture at a level most American businessmen never achieved. This was preparation. His father was positioning him not just to succeed in America, but to operate on a global stage. In August 1857, Pierpont moved to New York to work as a clerk at Duncan, Sherman and Company, the American branch of his father's firm. He was 20 years old, educated, connected, but still unproven. And in one of his first tests, he showed the kind of instinct that would define his entire career. While in New Orleans on business, Pierpont encountered a ship captain with a boatload of coffee and no buyer. Most clerks would have contacted their superiors for instructions. Pierpont did not wait. He used his company's funds to purchase the coffee himself. Then he sold it to local merchants for a profit. This was not just clever. It was bold. It showed that he understood opportunity had a time limit, that markets moved fast, that hesitation cost money. His success emboldened him to strike out on his own. In the early 1860s, he founded J. Pierpont Morgan and Company. He was not even 25 years old, but he already had the connections, the education, and the instinct to operate independently. And almost immediately, his personal life intersected with tragedy in a way that would shape him for the rest of his days. Through his New York social circle, Pierpont grew close to Amelia Sturgis, known as Memmy. She was the daughter of Jonathan Sturgis, a successful merchant and patron of the arts. They fell in love. They planned a future. But in the winter before their wedding, Memmy developed a severe cough that would not go away. Doctors diagnosed her with tuberculosis. In 1861, tuberculosis was a death sentence. Slow, painful, inevitable. Most young men would have postponed the wedding. Pierpont and Mamie did not. They married on October 7th, 1861, despite her failing health. They left immediately for a honeymoon trip to Europe, hoping the warm climate might help. Pierpont carried his bride onto the ship. He nursed her with desperate care. But no amount of love or money could stop what was happening inside her lungs. On February 17th, 1862, just 4 months after their wedding, Memmy died at the Villa Saint Georges in Nice, France. Pierpont was devastated. He returned to New York alone and threw himself into his work with a fury that people around him found almost frightening. Later in life, he would speak of Mamie with tears in his eyes, remembering those 60 days of marriage as both the happiest and most painful period of his existence. And something changed in him after her death. He developed mysterious nervous ailments, crippling headaches, depressions, exhaustion, afflictions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He sought cures at American and European spas. He traveled constantly, as if trying to outrun grief. And he threw himself into finance with the kind of intensity that only comes from needing work to fill the space where happiness used to live. In 1864, at the urging of his father, Pierpont partnered with senior banker Charles Dabney to form Dabney, Morgan and Company. His father, Junius, was now heading the London banking firm, renamed J.S. Morgan and Company after George Peabody retired. The Morgans were building a transatlantic financial network, funneling European investments into American enterprises. This was the engine of their growing wealth. America needed capital to expand. Europe had capital to invest. The Morgans stood in the middle, earning fees on both sides while building relationships that would last generations. In May 1865, 3 years after Mamie's death, Pierpont married Frances Louisa Tracy, known as Fanny. She was the daughter of a New York lawyer. The marriage was practical more than passionate. Pierpont needed a partner. Fanny provided stability. Together they would have 4 children. Louisa Pierpont Morgan, born 1866. John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., known as Jack, born 1867. Juliet Pierpont Morgan, born 1870. And Anne Tracy Morgan, born 1873. But the marriage was not happy. Pierpont and Fanny had vastly different temperaments. Pierpont hated to be alone and drew energy from crowds, motion, and travel. Fanny preferred the suburbs and a quiet family life. They grew apart, and while Pierpont maintained the appearance of a respectable marriage, he spent most of his time with other companions. He practiced what his biographers would later call serial monogamy outside his marriage, maintaining long relationships with women who understood his world in ways Fanny never could. And then there was his nose. In his 40s, an inherited skin disease called rhinophyma began transforming his nose into a hideous purple bulb. Excess growth of sebaceous tissue turned it into a deformity that could not be hidden. People stared. Caricaturists mocked. Photographers had to retouch every professional portrait. Pierpont became intensely self-conscious about it. He hated being photographed without permission. He avoided social events where he might be mocked. And yet, despite the deformity, or perhaps because he learned to carry it with such fierce dignity, he remained attractive to women. His power, his confidence, his ability to command a room, all of it outweighed the physical flaw that would have destroyed a lesser man. During the 1870s and 80s, Pierpont Morgan was reorganizing and consolidating railroads, gaining control of significant portions of America's rail network. By some estimates, he eventually controlled 1/6 of the nation's rail lines. This was not theft. It was not corruption in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle and more powerful. It was the ability to see patterns in chaos, to understand that competition was destroying value, that too many small railroads fighting each other meant inefficiency, waste, bankruptcy. Morgan would step in, buy up failing companies, merge them into larger entities, install professional management, and stabilize entire industries. He called it reorganization. Critics called it monopoly. Both were right. In 1890, Pierpont's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, died. And with his death, Pierpont inherited not just wealth, but the leadership of the entire Morgan financial empire. He was 53 years old, and he was just getting started. In the 1890s, Morgan began focusing on industrial corporations. He helped organize General Electric. He financed the creation of Federal Steel. And in 1901, after purchasing Andrew Carnegie's steel company for nearly $500 million, Morgan merged multiple steel and iron businesses into the United States Steel Corporation. It was the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. And it made Morgan not just a banker, but the architect of modern American industry. But the immense scope of his power, it came with immense responsibility. And in 1893, that responsibility nearly broke the country. Part 2. The Price of Power. The Panic of 1893 was one of the worst financial crises in American history. Banks failed, railroads collapsed, unemployment soared, and the United States government, the entity that was supposed to stabilize the economy, was running out of gold. The gold standard, which backed every dollar with a specific amount of gold, was in danger of collapsing. If that happened, American currency would become worthless. International trade would halt. The economy would enter freefall. President Grover Cleveland was desperate. Congress was paralyzed. And into that vacuum stepped J. Pierpont Morgan. In early 1895, Morgan formed a syndicate of international investors willing to supply gold to the United States Treasury in exchange for a favorable rate on 30-year bonds. He personally reassured a skeptical President Cleveland by citing an obscure 1862 statute that gave the Secretary of the Treasury the power to pull off such a transaction without congressional approval. The syndicate bought the bonds and quickly resold them, stabilizing the economy. Morgan saved the country, but he also made a profit. And that dual reality, that he could do good and do well at the same time, became the source of endless controversy. Was he a patriot or a profiteer, a savior or a manipulator? The answer, of course, was both. He believed deeply that his interests and the nation's interests were aligned, that what was good for Morgan was good for America. And for a long time, that belief held. But it would not hold forever. Following the death of his business partner Anthony Drexel in 1895, Morgan reorganized his company into J.P. Morgan and Company. The firm became a major player in the steel industry, then in dozens of other industries. Morgan spearheaded the formation of International Harvester, AT&T, and countless other corporations that still exist today. He held controlling interests in Aetna, Western Union, the Pullman Car Company, and 21 railroads. He was not just participating in the American economy, he was shaping it. But with power came scrutiny. Muckraking journalists began publishing exposés. Progressive politicians began calling for reform. The public, which had once seen Morgan as a hero, began to see him as a threat. And in 1907, that tension reached a breaking point. The panic of 1907 began in October when the stock market crashed. Banks ran out of money. People lined up to withdraw their savings. Trust companies, which were less regulated than banks, began to fail. The entire financial system was on the verge of collapse, and once again, the government could not fix it. So once again, Morgan stepped in. He gathered the most powerful bankers in New York into his private library. He locked the doors, and he told them they were not leaving until they agreed on a plan to save the financial system. For days they met. They argued, they calculated, and eventually, they pooled their resources to provide liquidity to failing institutions. Morgan personally pledged millions. He convinced other bankers to do the same. He convinced John D. Rockefeller to inject even more capital. And slowly, methodically, they stopped the bleeding. The crisis ended. The economy stabilized, and J. Pierpont Morgan was hailed once again as the savior of American finance. At 70 years old, he had pulled off the impossible twice. He had become the ultimate backstop, the man you called when presidents failed. But the public mood was shifting. Yes, Morgan had saved the economy, but the fact that one man could save the economy meant one man had too much power. The fact that Morgan could do what the government could not was not reassuring. It was terrifying. It meant private individuals controlled public welfare. It meant democracy was an illusion. It meant that real power lay not in votes, but in vaults. In 1912, Congress decided to investigate. The Pujo Committee, chaired by Representative Arsène Pujo of Louisiana, was tasked with determining whether a money trust existed, whether a small cabal of elite Wall Street financiers, including Morgan, colluded to control American banking and industry. The hearings began in late 1912, and Morgan, who hated publicity, who despised being questioned, was called to testify. The testimony was brutal. Politicians grilled him. They questioned his methods. They asked about his relationships with other bankers. They tried to force him to admit that he wielded too much power. Morgan remained calm, but those who knew him said the experience devastated him. He was not a man accustomed to justifying himself. He believed his actions spoke for themselves. The fact that he had to explain, to defend, to argue his case in front of politicians he considered inferior, it broke something inside him. After the hearings, Morgan traveled to Europe. He was exhausted, depressed. His health, which had never been robust, began to fail rapidly. He took a cruise down the Nile in the winter of 1913, hoping the warmth and rest would restore him. But instead, he entered a rapid decline. He seemed delusional, depressed. His companions and doctors believed he may have suffered a series of small strokes. On March 31, 1913, at the Grand Hotel in Rome, John Pierpont Morgan died. Nearly 4,000 condolence letters arrived overnight. Flags on Wall Street flew at half-mast. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 2 hours when his body passed through the city. His remains were interred in Cedar Hill Cemetery in his birthplace of Hartford, Connecticut. His estate was worth $68.3 million, equivalent to nearly $2 billion today. About $30 million represented his share in the New York and Philadelphia banks. The rest was art, rare books, manuscripts, gems, treasures he had spent decades collecting. His son, John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., known as Jack, inherited the banking business. But Jack was never as influential as his father. The world had changed. The Federal Reserve System was created in late 1913, just months after Morgan's death. The Pujo Committee hearings had led directly to its formation. The era when individual men could save economies was over. Power was being institutionalized, regulated, distributed. The age of the financial emperor had ended, and the Morgan family, for all its wealth, would never again wield the kind of personal power that Pierpont had commanded. But the darkness that clung to the Morgan name did not end with Pierpont's death. If anything, it deepened, because Jack Morgan would discover what his father never fully confronted. That being the most powerful family in America made you a target, not just politically, physically. Part 3. The Assassination Attempt. John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., known to everyone as Jack, was born on September 7, 1867, in Irvington, New York. He was the only son among Pierpont's children, which meant he carried the weight of expectation from birth. His father groomed him carefully. Jack graduated from Harvard in 1889. He joined his father's firm in 1892. He spent 8 years working in the London branch, learning the European side of the business. When his father died in 1913, Jack was 45 years old. And overnight, he became the head of the most powerful private bank in the world. Jack resembled his father in many ways. He disliked publicity. He was methodical, careful, deeply committed to the family's philanthropic legacy. In 1890, he married Jane Norton Grew, daughter of a Boston banker. They had 4 children together: Junius Spencer Morgan III, Jane Norton Morgan Nichols, Francis Tracy Pennoyer, and Henry Sturgis Morgan, who would go on to co-found Morgan Stanley. One other child, a daughter named Alice, died young of typhoid fever. This was the first shadow. Wealth could not protect a child from disease. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, Jack Morgan and his firm became the sole purchasing agent for the British and French governments. From 1915 until American involvement in the conflict, J.P. Morgan and Company purchased over $3 billion worth of military supplies and other goods on behalf of the Allies. The firm earned 1% of the total amount spent, making Jack Morgan extraordinarily wealthy while also making him extraordinarily controversial. Many Americans opposed involvement in the European War. Isolationists believed the conflict was not America's problem. German Americans, who made up a significant portion of the population, were horrified that Morgan was arming Britain and France against Germany. And some believed Morgan was not just profiting from the war. They believed he was engineering American involvement to protect his loans, that he was manipulating the country into war for personal gain. This accusation was false, but it did not matter. Perception is reality. And the perception was that Jack Morgan was a merchant of death, that he was growing rich while young men died in European trenches, that he represented everything corrupt about American capitalism. On the morning of July 3rd, 1915, Jack Morgan and his wife Jane were having breakfast at their 3-story mansion near Glen Cove on Long Island. The estate was called Mattinee Point, a 57-room neo-Georgian palace on East Island. With them were the British ambassador and his wife. It was a pleasant summer morning, peaceful, the kind of morning where violence feels impossible. At approximately 9 o'clock, the butler, a man named Physic, answered the door. Standing outside was a tall, lanky man who demanded to speak to Morgan. Physic hesitated. The man pulled 2 revolvers from his coat and forced his way inside. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The intruder chased after Morgan, weapons drawn. At some point, he encountered Morgan's young children and pointed a gun at them. Jane Morgan saw what was happening and tried to get the children to safety. Morgan himself came face to face with the intruder on the 2nd-floor landing. The man fired. Morgan, who weighed about 220 pounds, charged forward despite being shot. He toppled onto the assailant, knocking him to the floor. Jane Morgan pried one of the guns away. Physic the butler arrived and struck the intruder on the head with a lump of coal. Morgan had been shot twice. One bullet entered his groin and exited at his hip. The second shot went wild. He was rushed to the hospital. The would-be assassin was carted away to the police station. Morgan's injuries, while serious, were not life-threatening. Within 6 weeks, he was back at work. But the psychological damage lingered. The mansion that was supposed to be a sanctuary had been invaded. His children had been threatened. His life had been in danger. And the world now knew that being a Morgan meant being a target. The intruder initially refused to identify himself. He claimed to be a Christian gentleman who only wanted to persuade Morgan to end the war. But tips soon came in. Someone recognized his face. And the truth that emerged was stranger and darker than anyone expected. The man's real name was Erich Muenter. He was a German-American professor, a spy, a terrorist, and a murderer. Muenter had been born in Germany in 1871. He came to America in the late 1880s and taught at various universities, eventually landing a position at Harvard. In 1906, while teaching at Harvard, he poisoned his pregnant wife. The murder went undetected at first, but eventually police began to suspect him. Muenter fled to Mexico, disappeared for years, then re-emerged in Texas under the alias Frank Holt. He remarried, had a child, started teaching again, and slowly worked his way back to the Ivy League, this time at Cornell. But Muenter was not just a professor. He was a committed German nationalist. And when World War I broke out, he became involved with Abteilung 3B, the German secret intelligence network conducting sabotage operations in the United States. This network planted bombs on ships carrying American-made arms to Britain and France. They recruited sympathizers. They spread propaganda. They worked to keep America out of the war, or, failing that, to undermine American support for the Allies. On the evening of July 2nd, 1915, the night before he shot Morgan, Muenter planted a bomb in the United States Capitol building. He hid the device, packed with 3 sticks of dynamite, under a telephone switchboard in the Senate reception room. The bomb exploded at approximately 11:40 p.m., causing significant damage, but no casualties. Muenter had set the timer carefully to avoid killing anyone. He claimed he only wanted to make noise, to wake people up, to draw attention to what he saw as America's immoral involvement in a European war. After the explosion, Muenter fled to New York. He placed another pencil bomb on the SS Minnehaha, a ship loaded with munitions bound for Britain. Then he took a cab to Jack Morgan's estate, and he walked up to the door with 2 revolvers and a briefcase full of dynamite. His plan, as far as investigators could determine, was to take Morgan's wife and children hostage, to force Morgan to use his influence to stop munition shipments. But when confronted, he also admitted he intended to assassinate Morgan. The plan was incoherent, desperate, the work of a man whose mind had fractured under the weight of ideology and isolation. After his arrest, Muenter tried to kill himself by slashing his wrist. That attempt failed. Then, on July 6, 1915, while in police custody, he ran out of a briefly open cell door and threw himself headfirst onto the concrete floor of the jail corridor. The sound of his skull hitting concrete was so loud that guards initially thought he had smuggled a dynamite cap into the prison and set it off with his teeth. Muenter was dead. The next day, the bomb on the SS Minnehaha exploded. It did little damage and killed no one. Muenter's reign of terror was over. But the incident left Jack Morgan shaken. It proved that the Morgan name did not just attract political scrutiny. It attracted violence. It made the family a symbol. And symbols, throughout history, have always been targets. The 1920s and 30s brought new challenges. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Jack Morgan, along with other bankers, pooled funds in an attempt to halt the decline. Unlike his father, who had successfully stopped the panics of 1893 and 1907, Jack failed. The crash spiraled into the Great Depression. Millions lost their savings. Unemployment soared. And once again, the Morgan family faced accusations. This time, that they had caused the collapse through reckless speculation, that they had profited while ordinary Americans suffered. In 1933, the Banking Act forced J.P. Morgan and Company to separate its investment banking from its commercial banking activities. The investment division became Morgan Stanley, co-managed by Jack's son, Henry Sturgis Morgan. The commercial side remained J.P. Morgan and Company. The empire that Pierpont had built was being broken apart by regulation. The power was being distributed. The dynasty was being dismantled piece by piece. In 1934, allegations surfaced that American bankers had manipulated the United States into World War I to protect their loans to the Allies. The Nye Committee spent a month questioning Morgan and his associates. The press called them merchants of death. The hearings were brutal, and though the committee ultimately found no evidence of wrongdoing, the stress took its toll. 4 months later, Jack Morgan suffered a heart attack. He survived. But he was never the same. He scaled back his involvement in the firm. He watched his fortune shrink as the world changed around him. He had inherited power at its peak and lived to see it eroded by forces he could not control. Regulation, public opinion, political will. The very democracy his family had helped finance was now turning against him. On March 13, 1943, Jack Morgan died of a stroke in Boca Grande, Florida. He was 75 years old, the same age his father had been when he died. His estate was divided among his children. The great mansions were sold or repurposed. The art collections were donated to museums. And the Morgan family, while still wealthy, no longer dominated American finance the way they once had. But the story does not end there, because the Morgan legacy was not just in banking. It was in the institutions they left behind, the buildings, the collections, the philanthropic gestures that turned private wealth into public good. And one of those institutions, the Morgan Library, carried its own dark secret. Part 4. The Librarian's Secret. In 1905, J. Pierpont Morgan hired a young woman named Belle da Costa Greene to be his private librarian. She was 26 years old. She had minimal professional credentials. Her only recommendation came from Morgan's nephew Junius, who had met her while she was working at the Princeton University Library. By all accounts, Morgan should have hired someone with more experience, someone older, someone male. But Morgan, who trusted his instincts in business, trusted them in people too. And something about Belle Greene told him she was extraordinary. He was right. Belle Greene became one of the most prominent librarians in American history. She ran the Morgan Library for 43 years, first as Pierpont's private librarian, then as Jack Morgan's librarian, and finally as the inaugural director of the Pierpont Morgan Library when it became a public institution in 1924. She built one of the most important collections of rare books and manuscripts in the United States. She was known for her knowledge, her shrewd negotiation skills, her ability to outbid the wealthiest collectors in the world. When she walked into an auction room with her great plumed hat, other bidders became nervous. They knew she would pay whatever it took to acquire what Morgan wanted. In 1911, she purchased the only complete copy of William Caxton's printed edition of Le Morte d'Arthur for $42,800, a staggering sum at the time. Newspapers covered the sale. And Belle Greene became famous not just in library circles, but in the wider public. She was photographed often. She appeared in trade publications. She was featured in society pages, and people always commented on her appearance. Her dark hair, her wild hair, her darker complexion, her exotic beauty. What they did not know, what almost no one knew, was that Belle da Costa Greene was black. She had been born Belle Marion Greener in 1879 in Alexandria, Virginia. Her father was Richard Theodore Greener, the first black graduate of Harvard College. Her mother was Genevieve Ida Fleet, a teacher and school administrator. Both parents came from families considered part of the African American aristocracy. Educated, accomplished, respected within their own community. But in 1890s, America, being black, meant facing legal segregation, social exclusion, and limited opportunities, no matter how educated or accomplished you were. So after Belle's parents separated, her mother made a decision. She changed the family surname from Greener to Greene. Belle and her siblings adopted the middle name da Costa, suggesting Portuguese ancestry to explain their darker complexions. And the family began to pass as white. Belle was still in school when this happened. She did not choose it. Her mother chose it for her. But once the choice was made, Belle lived with it for the rest of her life. She attended Northfield Seminary for young ladies in Massachusetts, a school that did not admit black students. She worked at Princeton University Library, an institution that did not admit black students or hire black staff. And when Junius Morgan recommended her to his uncle, she walked into the Morgan Library as a white woman. And she never looked back. She destroyed her diaries. She burned private papers. She left almost no written record of her thoughts about race or passing. To friends and colleagues, she wrote thousands of pages of correspondence, capturing her wit, humor, brilliance, and ambition. But she never wrote about her family history. She willed that part of herself into oblivion. And for most of her life, it worked. People speculated. Newspaper reporters noticed her complexion, but no one knew for certain, and Belle never confirmed or denied anything. It was only in 1999, decades after her death, that her true identity was revealed. Jean Strauss, writing a biography of J. Pierpont Morgan, uncovered the truth. Belle da Costa Greene was Belle Marion Greener, the daughter of Richard Greener, a black woman who had spent her entire professional life passing as white in order to achieve what would have been impossible otherwise. The revelation forced historians to reckon with a painful reality. Belle Greene was brilliant. She was one of the greatest librarians of her generation. She transformed the Morgan Library into a world-class institution. She mentored scholars. She facilitated research. She championed women in a male-dominated field. And she did all of it while carrying a secret that would have destroyed her career if it had been exposed. What does that say about America? That a woman of her talent could only succeed by hiding who she was. That the Morgan Library, an institution dedicated to knowledge and culture, would not have hired her if they knew she was black. That even in the supposedly enlightened world of rare books and manuscripts, racial prejudice was so entrenched that passing was the only option. Belle Greene retired in 1948. She died in 1950 at the age of 70. She never married. She lived her entire life with her mother. And when she died, the secret she had guarded so carefully went with her, until it did not. Because archives remember, documents survive. And eventually, someone asks the right questions. The Morgan Library today celebrates Belle Greene. They have exhibitions about her. They name fellowships after her. They acknowledge her contributions. But they also acknowledge the tragedy, that she could not be fully herself, that she had to fragment her identity to achieve greatness, that even at the pinnacle of her career, she was living a lie forced on her by a society that valued whiteness over talent. This is the darkness at the heart of the Morgan story. Not just the assassination attempts or the financial panics or the congressional investigations, but the fact that even the institutions the Morgans built to promote culture and knowledge were infected by the same prejudices that defined American society. That even in a library filled with treasures from across the world, across centuries, across civilizations, a black woman could not exist as herself. Part 5. The Estates and the Monuments. The Morgans did not just build businesses. They built monuments. Physical spaces designed to announce their arrival, their permanence, their power. And like all monuments, these spaces carried stories that were more complicated than the polished facade suggested. J. Pierpont Morgan's primary residence was at 219 Madison Avenue in New York. In 1882, the family moved into the massive brownstone, and Morgan filled it with fine art, stained glass domes and skylights, and oriental rugs. The interior was designed by furniture maker Christian Herder. The home featured a red-columned drawing room, a gentleman's library with a raised fireplace, a 60-foot-long conservatory, and a marble-columned dining room. And it was the first home in New York City to be exclusively lit by Thomas Edison's newly invented electric lighting. The house was a museum, a statement, a demonstration that Morgan belonged not just to commerce, but to culture. Adjacent to the house, Morgan built his private library in 1906. He hired the architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White, and the result was an icily elegant building in the high Renaissance manner. The library was designed to hold Morgan's collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts. It was his sanctuary, the place where he went to escape the pressures of Wall Street, where he surrounded himself with beauty, history, and the kind of permanence that money cannot buy but can, apparently, collect. After his death, his son Jack made the library a public institution in 1924 as a memorial to his father. It remains one of the world's great research libraries. Scholars come from around the globe to study its holdings, and visitors walk through rooms that once held private treasures and are reminded that even the most personal collections eventually become public property, that even dynasties, in the end, must share. But Morgan's estates were not limited to New York. In 1872, he purchased the Craigston Estate in Highland Falls, New York, along the Hudson River. The original estate had been built in 1859 by a retired jeweler named Wycliffe Baldwin. Morgan bought it after Baldwin died in 1871. Over time, the property grew to about 700 acres. Morgan was not an outdoorsman. He did not particularly enjoy country life. But he understood that wealthy men were expected to have country estates. So he hired the Boston architectural firm of Peabody and Stearns to renovate the mansion in the late 1880s. A third floor was added, a Tudor-like wing, a conservatory. The changes were restrained. Morgan generally liked the house as it was, and his wife Frances did everything she could to keep him from making it too grand. Craigston became a summer retreat, a place to entertain. Morgan hosted Thomas Edison there, Nikola Tesla, Andrew Carnegie. The mansion was a stage where power met informally, where deals were discussed over dinner, where the men shaping America's future could relax away from the scrutiny of the press. But Craigston's story did not end with the Morgans. In the 1940s, after being turned into a golf and country club, the mansion burned down in a fire. The structure that had stood for nearly a century was gone in a night. Today, only remnants remain. The old ice house and greenhouse were converted into private homes. The carriage house and stables became apartments. And on the site where the mansion once stood, a new house was, built in the 1950s using surviving bricks and the original fireplace. That house gained its own fame in the 1970s when Billy Joel rented it. He completed his iconic song, New York State of Mind, there. And Summer, Highland Falls, which alludes to his time in the area. The album Songs in the Attic refers to the second-floor bedroom where the piano was located. So even in death, even after fire, the Morgan estate continued to shape American culture. Not through finance, through music. Morgan also owned properties in Glen Cove, New York. In Newport, Rhode Island. On Jekyll Island, Georgia. In London, he kept 2 adjacent townhouses where he stored the majority of his fine art collection. And in the Adirondack Mountains, he owned Camp Uncas, a 1,500-acre property with an iron foundry, a sugar house, and log cabins. Morgan equipped the main lodge with modern bathrooms, a kitchen, horsehair mattresses, and 2 Steinway pianos. He employed carpenters, stable hands, farmers, landscapers, and house staff. He even built a rail line to make the property more accessible. And he kept a train steaming in place at the local station in case business called him back to New York. These estates were not just homes. They were infrastructure. Systems designed to allow a busy financier to rest while remaining connected, to entertain while maintaining control, to project power even in leisure. And when Morgan died, these properties became problems. Expensive to maintain, difficult to justify. One by one they were sold, repurposed, or abandoned. The estates that were built to last generations rarely lasted beyond the men who built them, because maintaining a monument requires not just wealth, but will. And the generations that inherit monuments rarely have the same will to preserve them. They have their own lives, their own ambitions, their own sense of what matters. Part 6. The Conspiracy and the Myth. On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic departed Southampton, England, on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic. 4 days later, on April 14th, the ship struck an iceberg and sank. More than 1,500 people died. Among them were some of the wealthiest men in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, Benjamin Guggenheim, a mining magnate. All 3 perished in the freezing water. J. Pierpont Morgan had been scheduled to sail on the Titanic. He had booked a personal suite aboard the ship with his own private promenade deck and a bath equipped with specially designed cigar holders. But at the last minute, he canceled his trip. He remained in Europe, staying at the French resort of Aix-les-Bains to enjoy sulfur baths and massages. When news of the disaster reached him, he was reportedly devastated. But he was alive. And almost immediately, conspiracy theories began to spread. Why had Morgan canceled? Did he know the ship would sink? Was the Titanic disaster not an accident but a deliberate act of murder designed to eliminate Morgan's rivals? The theory gained traction over the decades. Some versions claimed Morgan orchestrated the sinking to kill Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim because they opposed his plans for the creation of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in December 1913, just over a year after the Titanic sank. And Morgan had been instrumental in its creation. So the theory argued that Morgan removed his opposition, then pushed through the legislation that centralized American banking. The theory is false, completely. There is no evidence that Astor, Straus, or Guggenheim opposed the Federal Reserve. In fact, Isidor Straus spoke in favor of a centralized banking system in 1911, a year before the Titanic sank. Astor and Guggenheim did not take public stances on the issue. And even if they had opposed it, murdering them would have been unnecessary. The Federal Reserve Act passed both houses of our Congress easily. There was broad support for banking reform. 3 wealthy men dying would not have changed the political calculus. Moreover, the logistics of the conspiracy are absurd. How could Morgan guarantee the Titanic would hit an iceberg? How could he ensure the ship would hit it in such a way that it would sink? How could he make sure Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim would all board the ship? How could he ensure they would all die and not survive in lifeboats? The theory requires levels of control and foresight that are simply impossible. But the theory persists because people want to believe it, because it fits a narrative that the wealthy control everything, that nothing happens by accident, that tragedies are always someone's fault. And Pierpont Morgan, the most powerful banker in the world, the man who owned the International Mercantile Marine, which owned the White Star Line, which owned the Titanic, makes a perfect villain. The truth is simpler and sadder. Morgan canceled his trip because he was old, tired, and sick. He had been experiencing health problems for years. Traveling across the Atlantic on a ship, even a luxurious one, was exhausting. He preferred to stay in Europe where he could relax, take treatments, and oversee the acquisition of art before France changed its laws to prevent Americans from exporting treasures. There was no conspiracy, just an old man making a practical decision that happened to save his life. But the myth will not die, because myths serve a purpose. They give people a story that makes sense of chaos. And the Titanic was chaos. A brand new ship, declared unsinkable, destroyed on its maiden voyage by a piece of ice. Over 1,500 people dead for no reason other than bad luck, bad design, and human error. That kind of senseless tragedy is unbearable. So people invent meaning. They create villains. They construct narratives where someone is in control, even if that control is evil, because evil is easier to accept than randomness. And Pierpont Morgan, who spent his life trying to bring order to chaos, who believed markets could be controlled, who thought power could be wielded responsibly, became the symbol of that desire for control. The man who could sink a ship to get what he wanted. The man who played with lives like they were pieces on a chessboard. The man who proved that wealth is not just corrupting, but murderous. None of it is true. But truth has never been the point of a good conspiracy theory. Part 7. The Legacy of Wealth. When John Pierpont Morgan died in 1913, his estate was valued at $68.3 million. That number shocked the public, not because it was high, but because it was low. Many people believed Morgan was worth far more. Some estimated he controlled hundreds of millions, even billions. But the autopsy of his wealth revealed something unexpected. Most of what Morgan controlled was not his. It was other people's money that he managed. His personal fortune, while enormous, was not the largest of his era. John D. Rockefeller was worth far more. Andrew Carnegie had sold his steel company for nearly $500 million. Morgan was rich, but he was not the richest. What he had was influence, relationships, trust, the ability to bring people together, to make deals happen, to stabilize markets. That kind of power cannot be counted in dollars. It exists in the spaces between transactions, in the phone calls that prevent panics, in the meetings that forge partnerships, in the handshake that seals a billion-dollar merger. And that kind of power dies with the man who wields it. You cannot inherit influence. You cannot pass down trust. Jack Morgan inherited his father's business, but he did not inherit his father's authority. The world had changed. Regulations had been put in place. The Federal Reserve existed. The government had learned how to intervene in financial crises. The age when one man could save the economy was over. Jack Morgan understood this. He tried to maintain the firm's prestige. He tried to uphold the family name. But he was constantly battling forces that were beyond his control. Public opinion, political will, the rising tide of reform. And when he died in 1943, the Morgan dynasty, as a force in American finance, died with him. But the institutions they built survived. J.P. Morgan and Company eventually merged with Chase Manhattan Bank to become J.P. Morgan Chase. one of the largest banks in the world. Morgan Stanley, founded by Jack's son Henry Sturgis Morgan, remains one of the most prestigious investment banks. The Morgan Library and Museum continues to serve scholars and the public. And across American industry, in steel, in electricity, in telecommunications, the fingerprints of the Morgan family are still visible. Not because Morgans run these industries today, but because the structures they built, the corporations they assembled, the systems they imposed became the foundation of modern American capitalism. This is the paradox of dynasty. The family fades, but the work remains. The individuals are forgotten, but the institutions endure. And whether that is a good thing or a bad thing depends on what you believe about power. If you believe power should be concentrated, that efficiency requires strong leadership, that markets need stabilization and only the wealthy have the resources to provide it, then the Morgans were heroes. They saved the country multiple times. They built industries. They created jobs. They turned American chaos into American order. If you believe power should be distributed, that democracy requires equality, that markets should serve people, not profit, then the Morgans were villains. They hoarded wealth. They manipulated systems. They resisted regulation. They proved that capitalism, unchecked, creates dynasties that undermine the very idea of a fair society. Both views are true, and that is the tragedy. Because the Morgans were not monsters. They were men who believed they were doing the right thing. They believed their interests and the nation's interests were aligned. They believed stability was worth the price of inequality. They believed power, in the right hands, could be used for good. And sometimes it was. Morgan's intervention in the panics of 1893 and 1907 did prevent greater suffering. His organization of industries did create efficiencies. His patronage of the arts did enrich American culture. But the cost was also real. The concentration of power in his hands meant others had less. The trust he commanded meant others were excluded. The dynasty he built meant opportunity was reserved for those born into the right family. And the darkness that followed the family, the assassination attempts, the congressional investigations, the forced dismantling of the empire, was not random. It was the consequence of that concentration. Power attracts violence. Wealth attracts envy. And dynasties, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually attract the forces that will tear them down. Part 8. The human cost. But beyond the political and economic legacy, there is another story, the human one. The story of individuals caught inside a machine that was bigger than any one person. Consider Belle da Costa Greene, brilliant and accomplished, forced to hide her identity for 43 years. She achieved greatness, but at what cost? She never spoke publicly about her family. She never acknowledged her father, the first black graduate of Harvard. She destroyed her personal papers to protect a secret that should never have been necessary. And when she died alone, having never been able to fully claim who she was. Consider Jack Morgan, who inherited an empire at its peak and spent 30 years watching it erode, who was shot in his own home, who testified before hostile committees, who saw his fortune shrink and his power diminish. He did not fail because he was incompetent. He failed because the world changed around him, and no amount of wealth or skill could stop that change. Consider Amelia Sturgis Morgan, who married the man she loved and died 4 months later, her body consumed by a disease that wealth could not cure. She existed in Pierpont's memory as a ghost, perfect and untouchable, the one thing money could not buy back. Consider the children, Jack's daughter Alice, who died young of typhoid, the unnamed sorrows that every family carries, the illnesses that strike without warning, the accidents that money cannot prevent, the grief that no fortune can soften. This is the truth that every dynasty learns eventually. Wealth protects against many things, but it does not protect against everything. It does not protect against illness. It does not protect against violence. It does not protect against the slow erosion of time. And it does not protect against the simple, terrible fact that every human life, no matter how powerful, is fragile. The Morgans built monuments. They built libraries, estates, corporations, systems. They left behind institutions that still shape American life. But they couldn't build protection against being human. They suffered. They grieved. They were targeted. They were investigated. They were misunderstood. And in the end, they died, just like everyone else. The library remains. The bank remains. The name remains. But the people are gone. And what remains is not the dynasty they imagined. It is the wreckage of an attempt to make wealth permanent, to turn money into immortality, to escape the one thing no one escapes. That attempt failed, not because the Morgans were weak, but because the attempt was always impossible. Part 9. The Final Reckoning. In the end, the Morgan family's story is an American story. It is the story of immigrants becoming powerful, of hard work transforming into empire, of individual ambition reshaping an entire nation. But it is also the story of power's limits, of how even the wealthiest family cannot escape scrutiny, violence, or mortality, of how every dynasty, no matter how carefully built, must eventually reckon with the fact that wealth does not equal permanence. When J. Pierpont Morgan died in Rome in 1913, flags flew at half-mast and the stock market closed in mourning. But within months, the Federal Reserve was created, institutionalizing the very power he had wielded personally. The government learned it could not rely on private citizens to save the economy. It had to build systems, regulations, safeguards. And in doing so, it ended the age of the financial emperor. When Jack Morgan died in Boca Grande in 1943, the world was at war. The power structures he had known were collapsing. The Banking Act of 1933 had already forced the separation of his firm's commercial and investment operations. The New Deal had created regulations that limited what banks could do. The government, not private bankers, was now the ultimate guarantor of financial stability. The dynasty that began with Miles Morgan stepping off a ship in 1636 had run its course. But the institutions remained. J.P. Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, the Morgan Library and Museum. These are not just footnotes. They are active, living entities that employ thousands, serve millions, and shape the world in ways the original Morgans could never have imagined. The family name faded from the headlines, but the family's work did not disappear. And perhaps that is the real legacy. Not the individuals, but the systems. Not the dynasty, but the infrastructure. Not the concentration of power in one family, but the distribution of that power across institutions that outlasted any single generation. The darkness that clung to the Morgan name, the assassination attempts, the congressional investigations, the forced dismantling, the hidden identity of Belle Greene, the deaths of children, the grief of widows, all of it is part of the story. Not a distraction from the success, but proof that success at that scale always comes with a shadow. If you stand today in the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, you can walk through rooms that once held Pierpont Morgan's private treasures. You can see the manuscripts Belle Greene acquired. You can trace the lineage of a family that shaped American capitalism. But you can also feel the weight of what is not there. The private grief, the hidden identities, the violence that broke into palaces, the regulatory forces that dismantled empires. The Morgan family proved that individuals can shape history. But they also proved that history shapes back. That power attracts opposition, that wealth attracts scrutiny, and that dynasties, no matter how powerful, must eventually submit to the forces they cannot control. That is the dark story behind America's financial power. Not a story of evil, but a story of limits, of the distance between what wealth can buy and what it cannot, of the space between the monuments we build and the lives we live inside them. The Morgans built an empire, and then they watched it become something else. Something public, something regulated, something that no longer belonged to them. That transformation was painful, but it was also necessary, because a democracy cannot survive when power concentrates in the hands of a few families, no matter how capable those families are, no matter how much good they do. Power must be distributed, wealth must be taxed, dynasties must be dismantled. That is the lesson written into every stone of the Morgan Library. Every portrait, every manuscript, every artifact collected by men who believed they could buy permanence. They could not. No one can. And perhaps that is not darkness. Perhaps that is just truth. The truth that every empire is temporary. Every dynasty ends. Every monument becomes, eventually, a museum. A place where strangers walk through rooms that once held private power and are reminded that nothing built by human hands can escape the reach of time. The Morgans are gone, but their story remains, not as a warning, not as a celebration, but as evidence that wealth is power, that power is dangerous, and that even the most powerful families, in the end, are still just families, fragile, mortal, human. That is the dark story of the family behind America's financial power. The story of how they rose, how they ruled, how they tried to build something permanent, and how, like everyone who has ever tried the same thing, they failed. Not because they were weak, but because permanence, in the end, belongs only to the monuments they left behind. And even monuments, given enough time, become ruins. The Morgan Library stands. The bank that bears their name continues. But the dynasty that built them is dust. And in that transformation, from dynasty to institution, from private power to public legacy, lies the entire story of American capitalism. The story of how individual ambition becomes collective infrastructure, how personal wealth becomes public resource, how family empires become, eventually, historical curiosities. That is what happens when the emperor dies. The empire does not disappear, it transforms, and the family that once commanded it becomes a footnote in the very history they helped create. The Morgans would have hated that. They built monuments to prevent it. But monuments, in the end, belong to everyone. And the Morgans, like every dynasty before them, learned what every dynasty must eventually learn. You cannot own history. You can only contribute to it. And once you do, it no longer belongs to you. Part 10. The Architecture of Ambition. Before we can fully understand how the Morgan Empire fell, we must understand how it was built. Not just financially, but architecturally, physically. Because the Morgans understood something that many wealthy families forget. Power needs a stage. Influence requires visibility. And dynasties are not just about money. They are about space. About claiming territory in ways that make your presence impossible to ignore. John Pierpont Morgan's library at 36th Street in New York was more than a storage facility for rare books. It was a declaration of intent. When he commissioned the building in 1902, he hired Charles Follen McKim of the prestigious architectural firm McKim, Mead and White. McKim had already designed the Metropolitan Club for Morgan and was working on expansions for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He knew how to translate wealth into architecture, how to make buildings speak. The library was designed in the high Italian Renaissance style, modeled after the villas of 16th century Rome. The exterior was constructed of blocks of Tennessee marble, fitted together so precisely that no mortar was needed. The blocks were dry laid, held in place by their own weight and the precision of the cuts. This was not just craftsmanship. It was a message that the Morgan Library would stand for centuries, that it was built with the same care and permanence as the great monuments of Europe, that this was not a temporary structure, but a permanent addition to American culture. Inside, the library was divided into three main rooms. The East Room, Morgan's study, where he conducted private business and met with select visitors. The West Room, the library proper, which held the rare books and manuscripts. And the Rotunda, which connected them, a circular space topped with a painted dome showing signs of the zodiac and allegorical figures representing art, science, and literature. The East Room was intimate, almost cozy despite its grandeur. Red silk damask covered the walls. A massive fireplace dominated one end. Above the mantel hung a portrait of Martin Luther by Lucas Cranach the Elder. The ceiling was painted with elaborate Renaissance-style decorations. And everywhere, on every surface, were objects. Bronzes, porcelains, miniatures, small treasures that Morgan had collected over decades. This was where Morgan worked, where he received the most powerful men in America, where he made decisions that shaped industries. And the room was designed to communicate something specific. That Morgan was not just a banker, he was a scholar, a patron, a man of culture who understood that civilization rested on more than commerce. The West Room was even more dramatic. 3 tiers of walnut bookcases lined the walls, reaching nearly to the ceiling. The shelves held Gutenberg Bibles, illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages, first editions of Dickens, Thackeray, Milton, letters written by George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Napoleon. The ceiling was coffered and painted. The floor was inlaid marble, and at the far end, tall windows flooded the space with natural light, making the gold leaf on the book bindings shimmer. This room was not just storage. It was theater. It was designed to overwhelm visitors with the sheer density of cultural achievement. To make them understand that Morgan had not just accumulated wealth, he had accumulated history itself, that he owned pieces of every major movement in Western civilization, that his library was not a collection but a cathedral, and the rotunda, connecting these two spaces, was perhaps the most revealing room of all. Small, elegant, with murals showing great figures from literary and philosophical history. This was the transition space, the place where you moved from the world of commerce in the East Room to the world of culture in the West Room. And the message was clear. For Morgan, these were not separate worlds. They were one: business and culture, wealth and beauty, power and knowledge, all woven together into a single identity. Morgan died before the library was finished, but his son Jack completed it according to his father's wishes. And in 1924, Jack made the decision that transformed the library from a private monument into a public institution. He opened it to scholars. He installed Belle da Costa Greene as director. He ensured that the collection his father had assembled would be preserved studied, and shared with future generations. This was not just generosity, it was strategy. Because by making the library public, Jack ensured that the Morgan name would be permanently associated with culture and learning. That generations of scholars would walk through those rooms and be reminded that the Morgans were not just bankers. They were patrons, benefactors, men who understood that wealth carried responsibilities beyond profit. But there was another layer to this decision. By giving away the library, Jack was also protecting it. Because in the 1920s and 30s, inherited wealth was becoming politically dangerous. The progressive movement had created estate taxes specifically designed to break up large fortunes. The government wanted to prevent the formation of permanent aristocracies. And one way to avoid those taxes was to transform private property into public institutions, to give things away before they could be taken. So the Morgan Library became a museum. The art collections were donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The estates were sold or repurposed. And the Morgan family, while still wealthy, began the long process of distributing the concentrated power their ancestors had built. This pattern repeated across Morgan properties. The Madison Avenue Mansion, the first private residence in New York to have electric lighting, was eventually demolished. The site is now occupied by an extension of the Morgan Library and Museum. The Glen Cove estate, where Jack Morgan was shot, became a country club, then private residences. Cragston on the Hudson burned down. Camp Uncas in the Adirondacks was sold. One by one, the physical monuments to Morgan power were dispersed, destroyed, or transformed. And yet, the library remains, not as Morgan built it, but as something larger. A research institution, a museum, a public space where anyone can walk through rooms that once held private power, where students can study manuscripts that Morgan outbid European royalty to acquire, where the concentration of wealth that defined an era has been transformed into a resource that belongs to everyone. This is both the triumph and the tragedy of the Morgan legacy. They built monuments that outlasted them. But those monuments no longer belong to the family that built them. They belong to the public, to history, to the idea that cultural treasures, no matter who assembles them, ultimately belong to civilization itself. Pierpont Morgan spent millions acquiring art. He believed deeply that America needed cultural institutions to rival Europe, that the young nation needed museums, libraries, collections that would give it legitimacy in the eyes of the old world. And he was right. The collections he assembled did contribute to American cultural development. They did establish institutions that still serve the public today. But he also believed those institutions should be controlled by men like him. That wealth and power naturally went together with cultural stewardship. That the same instincts that made him a successful banker made him a qualified arbiter of taste. And there, he was wrong. Because taste is not the same as wealth. Cultural value is not the same as market value. And the men who accumulate the most money are not necessarily the ones who understand art, literature, or beauty most deeply. This tension runs through the entire Morgan Library. On one level, it is a monument to connoisseurship. Morgan had excellent advisors. He hired Belle Greene, who had impeccable taste and shrewd judgment. The collection he assembled is genuinely important. Scholars still make discoveries in its holdings. Students still find inspiration in its rooms. But on another level, it is a monument to acquisition, to the idea that anything can be bought if you are willing to pay enough, to the belief that cultural heritage is property, that manuscripts written 1,000 years ago by monks who took vows of poverty can be owned by a banker who made his fortune reorganizing railroads. That beauty can be collected the same way you collect companies, by seeing what you want, calculating what it costs, and paying the price. Morgan never struggled with this contradiction. He believed he was saving cultural heritage by buying it, that without wealthy patrons like him, these treasures would be lost, sold piecemeal, scattered across the world. And he was not entirely wrong. Many of the manuscripts in the Morgan Library would not have survived without someone willing to pay for their preservation. But there is something dark about the fact that preservation required wealth. That culture could only survive if someone with Morgan's resources decided it was worth saving. That the decision about what parts of human history mattered was made not by scholars or artists, but by men who controlled capital. This is the shadow that falls across every room in the Morgan Library. Yes, it is beautiful. Yes, it is valuable. Yes, it serves an important purpose. But it exists because one man accumulated enough wealth to decide what culture looked like. And that power, concentrated in the hands of a single individual, shaped not just what was collected, but what was valued, what survived, what was remembered. The library is both a gift and a reminder. A gift of access to rare materials. A reminder that access depends on the generosity of those who control wealth. And in that dynamic, in that dependence, lies one of the fundamental inequalities of American life. That culture, like everything else, is shaped by money. That what we remember is determined not just by what mattered, but by what someone was willing to pay to preserve. Part 11. The Other Morgans. The story of the Morgan family is usually told through the lives of three men. Joseph Morgan III, who entered banking. Junius Spencer Morgan, who joined the international financial system. And John Pierpont Morgan, who became the most powerful banker in America. But families are larger than their most famous members. And the Morgan story includes people who never made headlines, but whose lives were just as shaped by the weight of the family name. Louisa Pierpont Morgan, Pierpont's eldest daughter, was born in 1866. She married Herbert L. Satterley, a lawyer and author. Louisa was present when her father died in Rome. She was one of the people who sat beside his bed in those final hours. And later, after his death, she became a custodian of his memory. She helped preserve documents. She provided information to biographers. She ensured that the story of her father's life was told in ways she approved of. But Louisa's own life remains largely invisible. We know she existed. We know she married. Well, we know she was part of the social circuit that defined Gilded Age New York. But beyond that, her story disappears into the category of dutiful daughter, supportive wife, keeper of family legacy. The role assigned to wealthy women of her generation. Visible but not heard. Present but not central. Important but not powerful. Juliet Pierpont Morgan, Pierpont's second daughter, born in 1870, married William Pearson Hamilton, a grandson of Alexander Hamilton. This was a marriage that connected two American dynasties. The financial power of the Morgans with the political legacy of the Hamiltons. But like her sister, Juliet's life is recorded primarily through the lens of family connections. Who she married, where she lived, what social events she attended, her own thoughts, ambitions, desires. They were not considered important enough to preserve. Anne Tracy Morgan, Pierpont's youngest daughter, born in 1873, was different. Anne never married. She became a philanthropist, a supporter of women's rights, and an advocate for France during World War I. She used her wealth to fund relief efforts. She established hospitals. She helped rebuild French villages destroyed by the war. For her efforts, the French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. Anne lived until 1952, long enough to see the Morgan dynasty fade. Long enough to watch the institutions her father built transform into something he would not have recognized. And long enough to prove that Morgan women, when given the chance, could wield power as effectively as Morgan men. But Anne was the exception. Most Morgan women were expected to be wives, mothers, hostesses, to manage households, to raise children, to maintain the social networks that supported their husbands' business dealings. Their work was essential, but invisible. Their contributions went unrecorded. And when they died, their stories were reduced to a few lines in genealogical records. Name, birth date, death date, spouse, children, nothing more. This pattern of erasure extended to the other branches of the family as well. Junius Spencer Morgan, Pierpont's father, had other children besides Pierpont. Sarah Spencer Morgan married a wealthy man and lived a comfortable life. Mary Lyman Morgan did the same. Junius Spencer Morgan Jr., Pierpont's younger brother, died at 11 years old. Just a child. A footnote. A name on a family tree with dates that bracket a life cut short. And Juliet Pierpont Morgan, Pierpont's sister, may not have married at all. The historical record is unclear. She existed. She appears in family documents. But beyond that, her life is a blank, as if being a Morgan woman who did not marry meant being too insignificant to remember. This erasure is not unique to the Morgans. It is the pattern of how history treats women, especially wealthy women. Unless they do something extraordinary, unless they marry someone famous, unless they are connected to power in ways that matter to the men writing history, they disappear. Their lives are reduced to supporting roles in other people's stories. And yet, those lives mattered. Louisa and Juliet and the countless other Morgan women managed households that functioned as centers of social power. They hosted dinners where deals were made. They maintained relationships that facilitated business connections. They raised children who would carry the family name into the next generation. Without them, the dynasty could not have existed. But their work was invisible, uncompensated, unrecognized. This is one of the darkest aspects of the Morgan story. Not the financial panics or the assassination attempts or the congressional investigations, but the quiet, systematic erasure of half the family. The women who made everything possible but were never allowed to be central to the narrative. Even Belle da Costa Greene, who achieved extraordinary success, did so by hiding her identity and remaining unmarried. She sacrificed family, heritage, personal connection to become the first director of a major American library. And when she died, she left almost no personal papers. She willed herself into silence, just as the Morgan women were silenced by the structure of their society. The pattern repeats across generations. Jack Morgan's wife, Jane Norton Grew, was the daughter of a Boston banker. She married into the Morgan family in 1890. She had 4 children, raised them through the chaos of World War I, the assassination attempt on her husband, the Great Depression, the congressional investigations. She died in 1925, and the historical record notes her death the way it notes everything about Morgan women. Briefly, factually, without depth. One of Jack's daughters, Alice, died young of typhoid fever. Her death is mentioned in genealogical records as a tragic footnote. But there are no details, no letters preserved, no glu of her personality, her interests, her dreams. She existed, she died, and history moved on. This is what dynasty does to people. It flattens them. It reduces individuals to their function within the family structure. The men become bankers, industrialists, power brokers. The women become wives, mothers, keepers of the domestic sphere. And everyone who does not fit those categories disappears entirely. The Morgan men, at least, had the option of rejecting the family business. They could choose to pursue art, literature, scholarship, anything outside of finance. The women did not have that option. Their roles were predetermined. And if they tried to step outside those roles, they risked losing everything. Family support, social standing, the security that came with belonging to one of the wealthiest families in America. Anne Morgan escaped this trap by never marrying, by dedicating her life to philanthropy, by using her wealth in ways that were acceptable for unmarried women. But even Anne had to work within constraints. She could not join her father's firm. She could not become a banker. She could not wield power directly. She had to channel her ambitions through acceptable outlets: charity, relief work, supporting other women. And even then, she is remembered primarily as Pierpont Morgan's daughter, not as Anne Tracy Morgan, philanthropist and advocate, but as the daughter of a famous father, defined by her relationship to a man, never fully her own person. This is the legacy that does not get discussed when people talk about the Morgan family. The generations of women whose lives were constrained, whose stories were erased, whose contributions were made invisible by a society that valued men's work over women's. They were part of the dynasty. They made it possible. But they were never allowed to be its center. And when the dynasty fell, when the Morgan name faded from the headlines, those women faded even faster. Because they were already halfway to invisibility, already reduced to supporting roles, already written out of the story before the story even ended. Part 12. The Cost of Collecting. John Pierpont Morgan spent the last 2 decades of his life in an acquisition frenzy that bordered on obsession. He purchased art, manuscripts, books, gems, antiquities, anything beautiful, rare, or historically significant. His agents traveled across Europe, attending auctions, negotiating with dealers, buying entire collections. And Morgan, sitting in New York or London or on one of his yachts, approved purchases worth millions. The scale was staggering. By the time of his death, his art collection was valued at $50 million, nearly 2/3 of his total estate. He owned paintings by Raphael, Rembrandt, Gainsborough. He owned medieval illuminated manuscripts, including the Farnese Hours, one of the most elaborate examples of Renaissance manuscript illumination ever created. He owned ancient Egyptian artifacts, Roman bronzes, Chinese porcelains, jewelry that once belonged to European royalty. To house this collection, he maintained multiple residences. The London townhouses at 14 Prince's Gate held most of his fine art. The library in New York held the manuscripts and rare books. The estates scattered across America and Europe held additional pieces. And everywhere he went, he was surrounded by beauty, by objects that represented the pinnacle of human creativity across centuries and cultures. But this collecting came with costs that were not financial. First, there was the cost to the countries and cultures from which these objects came. Morgan was buying art and artifacts during a period when European colonial powers were stripping colonies of their cultural heritage, when archaeological sites were being looted, when manuscripts were being removed from the monasteries and libraries where they had been preserved for centuries. Morgan claimed he was preserving these objects, that by purchasing them, he was saving them from destruction, neglect, or dispersal. And in some cases, he was right. Many of the manuscripts he acquired had been poorly maintained. The money he paid allowed institutions to fund other preservation efforts. His collection did save objects that might otherwise have been lost. But there is another side to this narrative. Morgan's collecting created a market. By paying extraordinary prices for rare objects, he encouraged others to seek out more objects to sell. This drove archaeological looting. It incentivized the removal of cultural heritage from its original context. It turned history into a commodity. And once objects entered his collection, they were removed from public access for years. Morgan kept them in private homes, shown only to select visitors. Yes, he eventually donated much of the collection to museums. But for decades, these treasures were private property, available only to those Morgan deemed worthy of seeing them. There is also the question of how Morgan chose what to collect. He relied on advisors, dealers, and experts like Belle Greene. But ultimately, the decisions were his. And his taste shaped what was considered valuable, what was preserved, what was remembered. Morgan preferred certain types of objects. He loved illuminated manuscripts, especially those with elaborate decorations. He collected old master paintings, but was less interested in contemporary art. He acquired antiquities but focused on Greek and Roman pieces, largely ignoring other cultures. His collecting reflected the biases of his class and era. A Eurocentric view of culture, a preference for the old over the new, a belief that civilization peaked in ancient Greece and Rome, and again during the Renaissance. This meant that objects outside those preferences were ignored. Artists working in his lifetime, unless they were already established, did not interest him. Non-Western art was acquired primarily as curiosities or ethnographic specimens, not as equal to European masterpieces. And entire categories of cultural production, folk art, popular culture, the material culture of ordinary people, were not considered worth collecting at all. Morgan's collection, for all its breadth, represents a very particular vision of what culture meant. A vision shaped by wealth, education, and the assumption that Western civilization represented the apex of human achievement. And because his collection became foundational to several major American museums, that vision shaped how Americans understood art and history for generations. This is not to say Morgan's collecting was evil. It was not. But it was not neutral either. Every collection reflects the values of its creator. Every museum built on donated collections carries the biases of those donors. And the Morgan Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and other institutions that house objects Morgan acquired, all bear the imprint of his taste, his priorities, his blind spots. There is also the sheer excess of it. Morgan acquired far more than he could ever personally engage with. He bought entire collections without examining every piece. He outbid rivals not because he necessarily wanted specific objects, but because he did not want to be outbid. The collecting became competitive, a way of demonstrating dominance, a proof that he had more money, more access, more power than anyone else in the game. Belle Greene once wrote to a colleague that Morgan's energy and drive were unfailing, that he succeeded in acquiring all of the world. This was not entirely hyperbole. Morgan approached collecting the way he approached business, with ruthless efficiency, with a willingness to pay whatever it took, with the belief that anything could be acquired if you wanted it badly enough. But what does it mean to acquire all of the world? What does it say about a man that he needs to own beauty in order to appreciate it? That looking is not enough. That experiencing is not enough. That he must possess. This compulsion, this need to own, is one of the darker aspects of Morgan's character. And it extended beyond art. He owned railroads not because he wanted to run trains, but because he wanted control. He organized industries not because he cared about steel or electricity, but because he wanted order. He accumulated companies the way he accumulated manuscripts, as objects, as pieces in a collection, as proof of his dominance. And when he died, all of it, the art, the companies, the estates, was distributed, sold, donated, scattered, because you cannot take it with you, because ownership is temporary, because even the wealthiest man in the world cannot control what happens to his possessions after he dies. Morgan spent millions building a collection that would survive him, and it did. But it survived as something different, not as his collection, as the public's collection, not as proof of his taste, as proof that even the most powerful men must eventually give up what they spent a lifetime trying to keep. Part 13. The Federal Reserve and the End of Empire. The creation of the Federal Reserve System in December 1913 was the final blow to the age of private financial power. And J. Pierpont Morgan, though he died 9 months before the Federal Reserve Act was signed, was one of the key forces behind its creation. This is one of the great ironies of Morgan's legacy. He spent his life wielding enormous personal power over American finance. He saved the economy twice by organizing private bailouts. He controlled vast networks of capital. He could make or break industries with a decision. And yet, his actions convinced the government that such power could not be left in private hands. The Panic of 1907 made this clear. Yes, Morgan stopped the crisis. Yes, he organized the bankers. Yes, he saved the system. But the fact that one man could do what the government could not was terrifying to anyone who believed in democracy. It meant that American financial stability depended on the goodwill of a private citizen. It meant that if Morgan had chosen not to intervene, or if he had been out of the country, or if he had simply been unable to act, the entire economy could have collapsed. This was unacceptable. A democracy could not function if its economic survival depended on the whims of individual bankers. So in the aftermath of 1907, serious conversations began about creating a central banking system, something that could provide the liquidity and stabilization that Morgan had provided privately, something that belonged to the government, not to Wall Street. Morgan himself supported this idea. He testified before Congress. He participated in planning committees. He understood that a central bank would formalize and institutionalize functions he had been performing informally. He believed a properly designed system would bring order to chaotic financial markets, and he was confident that men like him, experienced bankers with deep knowledge of markets, would play key roles in managing the new system. What he did not foresee was how quickly his own power would be rendered obsolete. The Federal Reserve Act created a network of regional banks overseen by a board of governors appointed by the president. It gave the government tools to expand or contract the money supply. It established protocols for dealing with financial crises. And most importantly, it meant that never again would America need to call on a private citizen to save the economy. Morgan died in March 1913. The Pujo Committee hearings had concluded just months earlier. And though the committee found no evidence of criminal wrongdoing, their report painted a damning picture. A small group of men, centered around Morgan, controlled vast swaths of American finance and industry. These men sat on each other's boards. They coordinated investments. They shared information. And whether or not they conspired in the legal sense, they functioned as a de facto cartel. The report recommended the creation of a central banking system to reduce dependence on private financiers. It recommended stricter regulations on interlocking directorates. It recommended greater transparency in financial dealings. And though it took time to implement these reforms, the trajectory was clear. The age of the financial emperor was ending. When the Federal Reserve Act passed in December 1913, it marked a fundamental shift in American capitalism. Power was being transferred from private individuals to public institutions, from Wall Street to Washington, from men like Morgan to government bureaucrats and elected officials. This shift was not total. Wall Street still wielded enormous influence. Bankers still shaped policy. Wealth still bought access. But the nature of power had changed. No longer could one man single-handedly stop a financial panic. No longer could private citizens decide whether the economy would survive a crisis. That power now belonged to institutions, to the Federal Reserve, to the government. Jack Morgan inherited his father's firm at precisely the moment when that firm's power was being curtailed. He tried to maintain the family's influence. He played a major role during World War I, managing billions in Allied purchases. He testified before congressional committees. He fought against regulations he viewed as excessive. But he was swimming against the tide of history. The Banking Act of 1933 forced the separation of commercial and investment banking, splitting J.P. Morgan and Company in two. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 imposed new regulations on how securities could be sold and traded. The Glass-Steagall Act prohibited commercial banks from underwriting most securities. Each new law was another nail in the coffin of the old system, the system where men like the Morgans had operated with minimal oversight. Jack Morgan fought these changes. He testified against them. He argued they were unnecessary, that they would harm the economy, that the market could regulate itself. But the public no longer trusted Wall Street to regulate itself. The Great Depression had destroyed that trust. Millions had lost their savings. Unemployment had soared. And whether or not Wall Street had caused the crash, the perception was clear. The financial system had failed. And the men who ran it, men like Jack Morgan, had to be brought under control. This is the final tragedy of the Morgan dynasty. Pierpont Morgan had spent his life building a system where competent, powerful men could bring order to chaotic markets. He believed deeply that stability required strong leadership, that democracy, at least in economic matters, needed to be balanced by expertise, that the masses could not be trusted to make sound financial decisions, and needed the guidance of those who understood how markets worked. He was not entirely wrong. Markets do need stabilization. Panics do require coordinated responses. Expertise does matter. But the system Morgan built concentrated too much power in too few hands. And when that power was used, even for good purposes, it demonstrated that private citizens had more control over the economy than the elected government. This could not last, and it did not. The Federal Reserve, the SEC, the various banking regulations of the 1930s, all of these represented the government reclaiming power that had been ceded to private financiers. The age of the Morgans was over, and in its place came an age of institutions, bureaucracies, regulations, oversight. Less dramatic, less dependent on individual genius, but also less vulnerable to the whims, failings, or deaths of powerful men. Jack Morgan lived long enough to see this transformation. He died in 1943, watching the empire his father built be dismantled piece by piece, not by competitors, not by market forces, but by the democratic will of a nation that decided financial power needed to be distributed, regulated, and controlled. This was not theft. It was not injustice. It was democracy asserting itself, saying that no family, no matter how capable, no matter how well-intentioned, should wield the kind of power the Morgans had held. That power belonged to the people. And the people, through their elected representatives, would decide how financial systems should work. The Morgans had helped build modern American capitalism. And modern American capitalism, once built, no longer needed them. That is the final darkness. Not that they failed, but that they succeeded so completely that they made themselves obsolete. Part 14. The Weight of a Name. To be born a Morgan in the early 20th century was to inherit more than wealth. It was to inherit expectations, scrutiny, and a legacy that could crush as easily as it could elevate. The children and grandchildren of John, Pierpont Morgan, grew up inside a machine that was bigger than any individual. A machine built on banking, railroads, steel, and the assumption that Morgans were special. That they were smarter, more capable, more deserving of power than ordinary people. Some of them thrived under this pressure. Jack Morgan took over the family business and ran it for 30 years. His son Henry Sturgis Morgan co-founded Morgan Stanley, which became one of the world's premier investment banks. These men proved they could carry the weight, that they could live up to the name. But others struggled. Junius Spencer Morgan III, Jack's eldest son, married Louise Converse and lived a quiet life. He served on corporate boards. He managed investments. But he never achieved the kind of prominence his grandfather and father had. He lived in their shadow, doing competent work that no one remembered because it was not spectacular. He died in 1960, having spent his life being compared to men who reshaped American finance. This is the burden of dynasty. Your achievements are measured not against your contemporaries, but against your ancestors. If you do well, it is expected. If you fail, it is catastrophic. And if you simply do your job competently without making history, you disappear. Jane Norton Morgan Nichols, Jack's daughter, married George Nichols and raised a family. She lived comfortably. She was part of high society. But her life is recorded primarily through her marriage, who her husband was, what organizations she belonged to, the society pages that mentioned her presence at events. Her own interests, passions, and personality are lost to history. Frances Tracy Pennoyer, another of Jack's daughters, married lawyer Paul Geddes Pennoyer in 1917. She lived through both world wars, the Great Depression, the transformation of American society. But the historical record treats her the same way it treats most Morgan women. As a name, a date, a marriage, nothing more. And then there was Alice, Jack and Jane's daughter, who died young of typhoid fever. She never had the chance to struggle with the family legacy. She never had to decide whether to embrace it or reject it. She simply died. And her death was absorbed into the family story as another tragedy. Another reminder that wealth cannot protect against disease, accident, or fate. These are the people who lived inside the Morgan dynasty, but were not central to its public story. They were raised with enormous privilege. They had access to the best education, the best health care, the best connections. They never had to worry about money, but they also never had the freedom to simply be themselves. Because being a Morgan meant something. It came with duties, with expectations, with the constant awareness that your life was not entirely your own. And for those who could not or would not meet those expectations, there was shame. Not public scandal, necessarily. The family was too powerful, too image-conscious to allow open failures. But private shame. The knowledge that you had been given every advantage and had not lived up to the family name. That you were a disappointment to people who had built empires. This pressure extended beyond the immediate family. Anyone who married into the Morgans inherited some of that weight. They were expected to behave in certain ways, to maintain certain standards, to understand that they were now part of something larger than themselves, a dynasty, a legacy, an institution that had existed before they were born and would exist after they died. And if they failed to live up to those expectations, they could be cast out. Not always literally, but socially, emotionally. The family could withdraw support, cut off contact, make it clear that they were no longer welcome in the inner circle. Because family, for the Morgans, was not just about blood. It was about maintaining the dynasty, about protecting the name, about ensuring that nothing and no one threatened the carefully constructed image of power and respectability. This is the side of dynasty that never makes it into the triumphant narratives. The people who were broken by the weight of expectation, the marriages that failed under the pressure, the children who grew up feeling like they could never measure up, the quiet desperation of trying to be worthy of a name that represented an impossible standard. And it was impossible. Because the standard was not just achievement, it was historical significance. Pierpont Morgan did not just run a bank, he reshaped American industry. He saved the economy. He became a figure of mythic proportions. How do you live up to that? How do you wake up every morning knowing that your grandfather was one of the most powerful men in American history, and you were just a person trying to do your job? The answer is, mostly, you do not. You do the best you can. You manage the investments. You serve on the boards. You maintain the family's social standing. You raise your children to understand the legacy, and you hope that is enough. But it is never quite enough, because the standard is not competence. It is greatness. And greatness, by definition, is rare. This is why dynasties eventually fail. Not because the descendants are incompetent, but because they are human. They have human limits, human flaws, human desires that do not align with the family's needs. And sooner or later, someone in the line is not willing or able to sacrifice their own life to maintain the dynasty. For the Morgans, that breaking point came gradually. There was no single moment of catastrophic failure, just a slow erosion. Jack Morgan had the ability, but not the power his father had. The next generation was even further removed. By the third and fourth generations after Pierpont, the Morgans were still wealthy, still connected, still prominent in certain circles. But they were no longer shaping history. They were just living their lives, using the money their ancestors had made to build comfortable, private existences. And perhaps that is not a tragedy. Perhaps that is freedom. Freedom from the crushing weight of having to be historically significant. Freedom to be ordinary, to be happy, to live without the constant pressure of dynasty. But it is also the end of something. The end of the belief that families could shape history across generations. The end of the dynasty as a force, and the beginning of the dynasty as a memory. A story people tell about the past, a reminder that power, no matter how carefully concentrated, eventually disperses. Part 15. The Phantom of Permanence. If you visit the Morgan Library and Museum today, you walk through spaces that feel frozen in time. The East Room, where Pierpont Morgan conducted business, looks much as it did when he was alive. The red silk damask, the Renaissance ceiling, the portrait of Martin Luther, the small treasures arranged on every surface. You can almost imagine him sitting there, making decisions that moved markets, shaping industries with a word. But he is not there. The room is a stage set, a recreation, a museum exhibit designed to evoke a time that no longer exists. The objects are real. The room is authentic. But the power that once filled it is gone. What remains is an idea, a memory, a carefully curated presentation of what wealth looked like when it was concentrated in the hands of individuals. This is what happens to all dynasties eventually. They become museums. The estates are preserved not as living spaces, but as historical sites. The collections are catalogued, labeled, and displayed. The family name becomes educational content. And the people who once wielded power become subjects of study. Interesting, important, but definitively past. The Morgan family is still with us, of course. Descendants of Pierpont Morgan are alive today. They still have money. They still have connections. But they do not have power in the sense that Pierpont had power. They cannot stop financial panics. They cannot reshape industries. They cannot save economies. That kind of power has been institutionalized, distributed, and removed from the hands of any single family. And this is probably good. Democracy cannot coexist with dynasties that wield that much influence. If individuals can do what governments cannot, then voting becomes meaningless. Elections become theater, and real power remains where it has always been, with those who control capital. The regulations that dismantled the Morgan Empire were designed to prevent this, to ensure that financial power would be exercised by institutions accountable to the public, not by private citizens accountable only to themselves. And while the system is far from perfect, while wealth still buys influence, while Wall Street still shapes policy, at least the fiction of democratic control is maintained. At least we pretend that power comes from votes, not vaults. But something was lost in this transition. The Morgan era, for all its inequalities, was comprehensible. You knew who had power. You could name them. Pierpont Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie. The villains, if you saw them as villains, or the heroes, if you saw them as heroes, had faces. They made decisions. They could be held accountable, at least in theory. Modern financial power is diffuse. It operates through corporations, hedge funds, private equity firms, algorithmic trading systems. The people making decisions are often anonymous. Committees make choices, boards vote, and individual accountability dissolves into collective responsibility, which often means no responsibility at all. You cannot storm the headquarters of an algorithm. You cannot shame a limited liability corporation. You cannot investigate a board that operates behind multiple layers of legal protection. The power is still there. It is still shaping markets, but it has become invisible, distributed, impossible to grasp. In this sense, the Morgan era was almost quaint. Yes, Pierpont Morgan had too much power. Yes, it was dangerous to have so much concentrated in one person. But at least you knew where to look. At least the battles were clear. Labor versus capital. Farmers versus railroads. The public versus the trusts. The lines were drawn. The sides were visible. Now, the battles are harder to see. The enemy is harder to name. And the nostalgic part of us, the part that loves clear narratives and comprehensible villains, misses the time when power had a face. Even if that face was deformed by rhinophyma and belonged to a man who crushed competitors and shaped industries to serve his own interests. This nostalgia is dangerous. It romanticizes an era of brutal inequality. It forgets the workers who died in factories Morgan controlled. The communities destroyed by railroad consolidations, the small businesses crushed by monopolies, the systemic injustices that allowed men like Morgan to accumulate such wealth in the first place. But it is also understandable, because at least those injustices were visible. At least you could fight them. At least there was someone to blame. The Morgan Library and Museum is a monument to this lost era. Not to the injustices exactly, but to the visibility of power, to the time when wealth built libraries that anyone could see, when bankers collected art that eventually became public, when dynasties constructed monuments that outlasted them. In our era, wealth hides. It operates through shell corporations and offshore accounts. It avoids taxes through legal loopholes. It accumulates in ways that are deliberately obscure. The new billionaires build rocket ships, not libraries. They buy social media platforms, not medieval manuscripts. And when they donate to charity, it is often to foundations they control, which serve their interests as much as the public good. This is wealth without responsibility, accumulation without contribution, power without the pretense of stewardship. And while there is something admirably honest about this, it is also bleak. Because at least the Morgans pretended their wealth served a purpose beyond their own enrichment. At least they built institutions. At least they left something behind that mattered. The question is whether we want to return to an era where individuals wield that much power. And the answer, if we are honest, is no. We do not. Because power concentrated in the hands of individuals is too easily abused. Too dependent on the character of those individuals. Too vulnerable to the accidents of personality, health, and mortality. But we also do not want a world where wealth accumulates without purpose, where the super-rich hoard resources without building anything that outlasts them, where dynasties are purely parasitic, extracting value from society without contributing anything back. This is the challenge. How to distribute power while ensuring it is used responsibly. How to prevent dynasties without losing the institutions dynasties sometimes create. How to build libraries and museums and cultural resources without relying on the generosity of billionaires. The answer, presumably, is democratic institutions funded by democratic means. Taxes that capture a fair share of wealth. Public funding for libraries, museums, universities. Systems that do not depend on the whims of individual donors, but are instead supported by collective will. But we are not there yet. We are still living in the aftermath of the Morgan era, still navigating the space between the old dynasties and whatever comes next, still trying to figure out how to build a society where wealth serves the public good without concentrating enough power in private hands to threaten democracy itself. The Morgan Library stands as a reminder of both the possibility and the danger. The possibility that wealth can build beautiful things. The danger that beautiful things are not enough to justify the system that creates such wealth. And the question, never fully answered, of whether we can have one without the other. Whether we can build permanent institutions without permanent dynasties. Whether we can preserve the monuments while dismantling the structures that made them possible. That is the legacy John Pierpont Morgan left behind. Not an answer, but a question. And the question remains open. Part 16. The final verdict. So what in the end do we make of the Morgan family? What verdict do we render on a dynasty that helped build modern America while also demonstrating the dangers of concentrated wealth? The easy answer is to see them as villains. As robber barons who exploited workers, manipulated markets, and used their wealth to corrupt democracy. This narrative is not wrong. The Morgans did benefit from systems that were profoundly unjust. They did wield power that should never have been in private hands. They did resist regulations that would have made society more equitable. But the easy answer is also incomplete. Because the Morgans were not cartoon villains, they were human beings navigating a system that rewarded the accumulation of wealth and power. They believed, genuinely, that they were serving the public good, that their work stabilized markets, that their patronage preserved culture, that their institutions would outlast them and continue serving society. And in some ways, they were right. The Morgan Library does serve scholars. J.P. Morgan Chase does employ hundreds of thousands of people. Morgan Stanley does facilitate capital formation. The institutions the Morgans built, even as they were transformed and regulated and brought under democratic control, continue to function. So the verdict is complicated. The Morgans helped build a system that was both productive and exploitative. They created institutions that were both beneficial and dangerous. They left a legacy that is both admirable and troubling. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion, that the Morgan story is not a morality tale with a clear lesson. It is a mirror. It shows us what we value, what we fear, what we hope for, what we want to prevent. We admire the ambition, the drive, the willingness to build something larger than oneself. We respect the vision that created industries, stabilized economies, and preserved culture. We acknowledge that some of what the Morgans built has genuine value. But we also fear the concentration of power, the inequality that results, the way dynasties can corrupt democracy, the fact that private citizens once had more control over the economy than elected governments. We recognize that this was dangerous, that it had to change, that the regulations that dismantled the Morgan Empire were necessary. Both of these reactions are valid, and they exist in tension, because we want the benefits of ambitious, capable people building institutions without the dangers of those people accumulating too much power. We want the library without the dynasty, the culture without the inequality, the beauty without the exploitation. This is an impossible desire, but it is a deeply American one. The belief that we can have it all, that we can encourage individual achievement while ensuring collective well-being, that we can reward success while preventing dominance, that we can build monuments while distributing power. The Morgan family's rise and fall demonstrates both the promise and the peril of this belief. They rose because the system rewarded their ambition. They fell because the system eventually decided they had risen too high. And what remains is not a dynasty, but a collection of institutions, stories, and questions. The institutions still serve us. The stories still fascinate us, and the questions still challenge us. How do we balance individual achievement with collective good? How do we encourage the building of lasting institutions without creating permanent dynasties? How do we preserve the monuments wealth creates while ensuring that wealth itself is distributed more fairly? These are the questions the Morgan story forces us to confront. Not because the Morgans were uniquely good or uniquely evil, but because they were, in many ways, typical. They did what successful people in their era were supposed to do. They accumulated wealth, they built power, they tried to make it permanent, and they failed at that last part. Because nothing is permanent. Dynasties fall, empires crumble, even monuments, given enough time, become ruins. The only constant is change. The only certainty is that every system that concentrates power will eventually face forces that redistribute it. This is not a tragedy. It is simply history. The rhythm of rise and fall that shapes all human institutions. The Morgans had their moment. They wielded enormous power. They built impressive things. And then their moment passed. The power was distributed. The things they built were transformed. And the dynasty became a story. That story is dark in places. It includes death, violence, hidden identities, exploitation, and the systematic erasure of people who did not fit the narrative of success. But it is also illuminating, because it shows us what we are, what we value, what we build, what we destroy, what we remember, what we forget. And in that reflection, we see not just the Morgans. We see ourselves. our own ambitions, our own contradictions, our own struggle to build things that last while knowing, deep down, that nothing lasts forever. That is the final dark truth. Not that the Morgans were evil, not that wealth is inherently corrupt, not even that dynasties always fail, but that everything we build, no matter how carefully, how beautifully, how permanently it seems, is temporary. That we are all trying to create meaning in a world where meaning fades. That we are all building monuments that will eventually become museums, and museums that will eventually become ruins. The Morgan Library stands today as a testament to this truth. It is beautiful. It is valuable. It serves an important purpose. And it is also, fundamentally, a memorial. A preserved moment of a time that no longer exists. A reminder that wealth, power, and ambition cannot buy the one thing everyone wants most: permanence. You can build a dynasty. You can accumulate art. You can reshape industries. You can save economies. You can leave your name on buildings that will stand for centuries. But you cannot escape the fundamental fact of mortality, of change, of the relentless forward motion of time. John Pierpont Morgan tried. He built monuments. He collected history. He tried to make his name permanent. And in a sense, he succeeded. His name is still known. His library still stands. His legacy still shapes American finance. But the man is gone. The power is gone. The dynasty is gone. What remains is just what everyone leaves behind. Stories, objects, memories, institutions transformed beyond recognition. And the quiet acknowledgement that all of it, eventually, belongs not to the people who built it, but to the people who come after. That is the dark story of the family behind America's financial power. Not a story of triumph or tragedy, but a story of limits. The limits of wealth, the limits of power, the limits of what any family, no matter how exceptional, can achieve or preserve. The Morgans reached those limits. They pushed against them as hard as anyone has. And they learned what everyone learns who pushes that hard. The limits hold. The rest is just commentary. Beautiful, fascinating, troubling commentary. But commentary nonetheless on a truth that no amount of money can change. We are all temporary. Everything we build is temporary. And the only permanence is in the stories we leave behind. Stories that future generations will tell, interpret, judge, and eventually forget. That is the Morgan legacy, not a dynasty, but a story. And now that you have heard it, you carry it forward for a while, until you too become part of the past that someone else will study, wonder about, try to understand. That is how history works. It is not about great men or powerful families. It is about all of us, trying to build something that matters, trying to leave something behind, trying to create meaning in a world where meaning is always, inevitably, temporary. The Morgans succeeded at this better than most. Their monuments are grand. Their story is compelling. Their impact is undeniable. But in the end, they failed at the same thing we all fail at. Escaping time, escaping change, escaping the fundamental truth that nothing, no matter how well built, lasts forever. That is the darkness, not evil, not corruption, just impermanence. The slow, patient, inevitable force that reduces all dynasties to dust, all monuments to museums, and all power to memory. The Morgan story is over. But the question it raises remains. What will we build? What will we leave behind? And when our own moment passes, what will people say about how we used our time, our resources, our power? That is the question the Morgan Library asks everyone who walks through its doors. Not through words, but through its mere existence. A monument built by private wealth, transformed into a public good, standing as both achievement and warning. Achievement because it exists, because it serves, because it preserves beauty and knowledge and history. Warning because it reminds us that private power, unchecked, is dangerous. That dynasties, however well-intentioned, must eventually be brought under democratic control. That the price of stability is not eternal rule by the competent few, but constant vigilance by the many. Both lessons are true. Both are important. And both are written into every stone, every manuscript, every object in the Morgan collection. This is why the story matters. Not because the Morgans were special, but because they were emblematic. They represent an entire era, an entire approach to wealth and power, an entire set of assumptions about how society should work. Those assumptions have changed. That era has ended. But the questions remain. How should wealth be used? Who should wield power? What responsibilities come with success? What do we owe to the future? What legacies are worth building? And what price are we willing to pay to build them? The Morgans had their answers. We must find ours. That is the final legacy of the family behind America's financial power. Not answers. Questions, endlessly compelling, endlessly troubling questions about money, power, democracy, culture, and the human desire to build something that lasts. The library stands. The questions remain. And the dark truth at the heart of it all, the truth that runs through every room, every collection, every carefully preserved artifact, echoes across the years. Nothing lasts, but we build anyway. Because building is what we do. Because meaning matters even when it fades. Because the monuments we leave behind, however temporary, are how we prove we were here. The Morgans were here. They built, they shaped, they mattered. And now, like everyone before them and everyone after, they are gone. Leaving behind only what all of us leave. Stories, objects, questions, and the endless patient work of time, turning everything we build into everything we were.